Everyone, my name is David Caron. It's my pleasure to moderate the first panel, and I'd like to welcome all of you and welcome those who are watching through a webcast. Like our chair, I'm very excited to hear the reaction of these three distinguished members of the Berkeley community who were present in Copenhagen. Like our chair, I was a coward. I would not travel to Copenhagen. I was hesitant to go into that environment, but I think we all want to understand what was happening. I think this first panel focuses on a political dimension of these negotiations and the way forward, the two questions posed in your program. Our approach is going to be, we're going to speak in alphabetical order, and we'll take about 12 minutes each, and then we're going to open it to questions from the floor and to a discussion among ourselves and you to explore these questions. The three panelists we have are Rob Collier, who's a research scholar with the Environmental Policy Center at the Goldman School of Public Policy on the campus. He looks at international negotiations generally in the climate change area. Next is Blas Henriquez, and Blas is a Mexican national who is also he's the director of the Environmental Policy Center at the Goldman School. And Blas was a member of the Mexican delegation to the climate change talks in the past. At Copenhagen, he was a member of the UC delegation as well as the California delegation, and got a closer look than some did at the negotiations. And finally, John Zysman of political science and with the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. John has been involved with the pressing international problems for several decades and involved in the international economic aspects of those problems, and I think can see this problem through that dimension as well. So let's start right in, and please, Rob.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to make a few comments on three basic topics. One, I'd like to briefly address the overall crisis in the negotiations, which, as we've heard already, are hitting some serious roadblocks and are not getting the traction that the world has hoped for or the world needs. I'd like to suggest some fundamental changes that are happening in the structure of the negotiations, particularly regarding the role of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And finally, I'd like to look at a couple next steps of where the heck do we go from here. As far as the overall Copenhagen talks and the very uncertain outlook going forward, it's clear that traction has been very poor, and there are a number of causes, one of them being the lack of action from the U.S. Congress. It's very hard to get commitments from foreign nations, especially the developed nations, if the U.S. Congress has not taken any action on its climate legislation. And with the very uncertain outlook of health legislation, it's even more uncertain what will happen with U.S. climate legislation. So it does, in fact, come back to home. It does come back to Washington, and many international actors around the world are looking at us, are looking at Washington and saying with folded arms, well, you act first. And U.S. leadership is crucial, and it is local, it is domestic in many respects. So parsing out the complex diplomatic aspects of the negotiations ultimately comes back to domestic politics. In the past several weeks after Copenhagen, there's been a very quick rush of postmortems and spinning of the uncertain results and questioning of whether the UNFCCC really is the appropriate venue for the negotiations. There's been a lot of talk from Obama administration allied groups and actors in Washington suggesting that, in fact, the UNFCCC is not the right venue, that perhaps, take your pick, the Major Economies Forum, which was originally started by President Bush, essentially as a rival to the UNFCCC, might be a better venue, or the G20, or now people are even talking about the G2, the US and China. So exactly where should the real focus be? Should it be in the United Nations, which is messy? There are 193 countries to negotiate. Can you really put Bolivia and the United States in the same room and get a result? And 191 others. Is this feasible? The actual mechanics of the negotiations, and politically, is it feasible? So these are increasing questions about whether we really should be focusing on the whole United Nations process, which since the Earth Summit in Rio, all these many years, has been the venue, has been the vehicle. So in terms of diplomatic process, very suddenly, fundamental questions are being raised attacking the legitimacy of the United Nations as host of these talks. In terms of the results in Copenhagen, we've got very substantive disagreements on many issues. Financial, for example, even the achievements of the Copenhagen Accord, $30 billion for the period of 2010 to 2012 and $100 billion per year by 2020. The exact provenance of these funds was left very vague in the accord, which said only that, quote, "This funding is intended to come from a wide variety of sources, public and private, bilateral and multilateral, including alternative sources of finance." Now, what that means is anybody guess. We can all in this room hazard a guess as to where that will come from, exactly who will provide which amounts of funds. It is clear, however, that a large chunk is meant to come from the private sector. Now, how exactly will that funding be leveraged from the private sector? What will be the governmental and multilateral tools by which these private funds will be leveraged? Again, is very much unclear and left to future negotiations in whatever forum might be most appropriate. More broadly, however, at Copenhagen, there was a real disconnect regarding the view of what really was the subject matter at hand. Was it strictly climate, or was, as became increasingly apparent, the subject power? I've been following international negotiations for many years, for a long time as a journalist on many topics, and the rule of thumb is that what's at hand is not just what appears to be at hand in terms of the very specific dispute of the theme, but power relationships. And for many nations at Copenhagen and in this whole process, what is being negotiated is not just climate, it is international power relationships. The United States and its allies prefer not to see it that way. In Copenhagen, if you would talk with the U.S. negotiators, for example, as I did, they're actually they tend to be wonderfully earnest, technocratic, brilliant, very deep in the weeds of the policy details at hand, but not seeming to recognize the expectations of developing nations that fundamental power relationships will be shifted as a result of these negotiations. Just as one of the sleeping topics in the U.S. Domestic climate legislation negotiations in Congress is how this will affect the overall economy, not just the specific policy tools. So in the international arena, this is really all about the power, whether developing nations will start being in charge rather than simply being the recipients of charity. As far as developing nations go, there's a very interesting phenomenon that they're copying the United States. The U.S. Role in foreign policy, the U.S. exercise of foreign policy has to largely unexplored degrees changed by the whole phenomenon of private contracting, private military contracting, and private foreign policy contracting. It's not just the Blackwaters of the world, but an endless alphabet soup of other contractors who work for everything from AID to the State Department in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Well, in climate, that phenomenon is mirrored with developing nations. For example, in Copenhagen, one of the chief negotiators for Sudan was a Filipina working for an NGO based in Malaysia called the Third World Network. Her name is Bernaditas de Castro Muller, doesn't speak a word of Arabic. She's a Filipina. She was one of the chief Sudanese negotiators, especially on the technology issue, helping drive Sudan's position with a very internationalist, leftist position. Ditto Bolivia, another one of the key countries blocking progress, or blocking the U.S. version of progress at Copenhagen. Their chief technology negotiator was an Indian national, doesn't speak a word of Spanish, but speaking with and negotiating with the full authority of the Bolivian government. These are, again, the Blackwaters of the world for climate, for the developing nations. And their role, I think, needs to be more fully investigated, just as the role of the U.S. contractors need to be analyzed in how they really affect U.S. military policy and the projection of U.S. power abroad. So what now? Well, we have various different fora, possible fora for action, G20, G2, Major Economies Forum. I would argue that what's really most important is getting some traction now on very specific topics. I mean, the whole overall panorama is so daunting that I think you really have to focus on being practical. And on a couple areas, technology, which Blas and I have worked on here at the Center for Environmental Public Policy at the Goldman School, and there's a report on the table back there, which we'd love you to look at, based on a conference that we held in October on the issue of technology transfer. Technology is an issue where there's actually a lot of hope at Copenhagen. It's one of the issues that's relatively close to reaching some sort of deal. Developing nations are asking for a international network of technology cooperation centers around the world, and the U.S. is rejecting or resisting any sort of bricks and mortar formulation of that. It would prefer a much more cloud-oriented framework. But in any case, the idea of technology cooperation on diffusing and deploying clean technologies around the world is an issue where there can be real forward progress. Another area that came really, really close in Copenhagen was the issue of forestry. what's called RED+, creating an international system to reduce deforestation and enhance forest carbon stocks in developing nations. Again, very, very close. We could, in one of these next meetings over the next bunch of months, have the United States and the other nations make a deal and show through example by creating real traction, rubber hitting the road, that all is not lost. And we don't have to wait to figure out these larger, complex venue questions, which are going to be intensely difficult to figure out, or the overall power relationships. I'd like to close, however, by just mentioning U.S.-China cooperation. Cooperation needs to be effective, it needs to be real, and the U.S. and China over the past several months have created a group of specific initiatives to do energy cooperation. However, there's been lamentably little funding and lamentably little real progress on setting these initiatives up. And again, if we're to lead by example and lead by creating real traction on the road, this is what needs to happen. You need to create movement so that the whole progress of the whole process does not bog down. So that's the end of my comments, and we can discuss it more in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob, very quickly, you were saying two problems. Like Chris Edley, you were saying that U.S. leadership is needed, and it ties back to domestic politics and Congress not acting. That's a problem. Second problem, maybe we need a different forum. Which is, do you have a sense of, in your mind, which is the bigger problem? If the U.S. had been leading, would Copenhagen have been different? If we change the forum and the U.S. is not leading, are we going to have the same problem?
To give a quick 15-second answer, I think the U.S. leadership is totally crucial. And not to be too self-referential, it's all about us, it's all about me, which is the natural human reaction. But it is true. It is all about us, and it is all about the collective me in Washington.
Thank you. Thank you. Blas, please.
Thank you, Dave. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Dan Farber and the organizers of the conference for inviting me to participate in this panel. I will first address the questions posed to the panel. Then I will talk about my experience at Copenhagen. Finally, I'll offer some perspectives from the different hats that I wore during the event, and offer you some ideas based on what I'm working now in my research. First, what were the major forces shaping the negotiations? I would say that despite all the hard work ahead of the negotiations by the Danes, an alliance of a group of major emerging economies had the last word at COP15. The boycott, or maybe positioning, as Rob was mentioning, of Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, and in the game of the Gs, this group is called the G8 plus 5 minus 1. Why? Because Mexico, it's also another developing country invited to the G8 meetings, but it's not included in this new climate alliance for the negotiations on climate change. Some observers believe that this is because, from the perspective of this new grouping of countries, Mexico is too close, obviously, to the U.S. because of economic regional interests, and also Mexico has had some more progressive proposals and actions. In fact, Mexico was the first major emerging economy or developing country to announce some voluntary commitments in Poznan, putting pressure on this group of countries to do also the same, as well as the very proactive promotion of the Mexican Green Fund proposal by President Calderon. So in some ways, Mexico has been different in how it has acted in this context. The U.S. came with an important financial offer of support, but from the perspective of the developing countries, lacking moral authority. As we said, there's lack of action in the U.S., so why are you telling us to do something of a problem that you caused? We need to grow, we need to take care of poverty, development issues. So, in the case of Europe, another important group that has been very proactive, they have, we all know about the EU emissions trading system. They have announced very ambitious targets. Well, this group ended up not being influential at all. And there was some leadership from UK, France, and Germany, but it was a weak consensus on how to go about and to advance the negotiations. In fact, we could call this a personality issue. The three leaders have very strong personalities. So in summary, nobody wants to initiate the expensive transition to a low-carbon future without seeing what others will do first or commit to, which seems to be the eternal dilemma in the UN negotiations. What are the possible avenues for the next round of negotiations? A possible solution that is being now discussed is to review process and reframe the discussion. The way negotiations were conducted in Copenhagen will need to be changed. Fresh and innovative ideas on how to address issues in a more inclusive and transparent manner need to be introduced. More importantly, reframing and enhancing the dialogue on contentious issues with more voices from other sectors beyond national governments to be included. And perhaps this will allow to move beyond the frameworks that is now almost 20 years old. The frameworks are almost 20 years old, based on a multilateral, consensus-based, one country, one vote UN approach. Change is urgent as real, effective, efficient, and equitable action on addressing climate change can't wait anymore. So, I will offer you three perspectives. I was, as David mentioned, I was part of the UC delegation, but I ended up joining the California delegation. It was not a formal delegation, but it was a group that was accompanying the governor, so it was interesting to see what happened in that context. From the perspective of the Mexican government, because I've been working with the Mexican government on policy and climate issues for more than 10 years now. And last year I was invited to join the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, which is the center that was created for Lord Stern, the author of the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, who is an influential opinion leader now, no longer in the government, influencing a lot what the UK how the UK climate policy is positioned within the negotiations. So, first, my participation. I attended COP, as I said, as many of us here as a UC delegation. That meant I had an NGO badge. Believe me, that was not a good thing. I waited in line for, in my case, I was very lucky, only 2 hours in the cold and snow, plus a couple of more inside the building just to get registered and get my badge printed. There were horror stories about people waiting 6-8 hours outside without getting anything done, and maybe even not being able to get at all inside the building. In the past, I was very lucky, as David mentioned, to join all these meetings with a pink badge, which is a party badge, and it allows you to be a fly in the wall in bilateral, in all the forums that your party is active. And there's a lot of affinity groups. Mexico is part of a very weird affinity group called the Environmental Integrity Group, which is formed by Mexico, Korea, and Switzerland, because Mexico is non-Annex 1, but it's part of the OECD. And Switzerland, it's Annex 1, but it's not part of the EU. So there's all these crazy groupings. Other more constructive is like Mexico takes the lead with the Mesoamerican group, which is Mexico and Central America, in capacity building, training, and supporting the efforts of climate change in Central America. The Mexican government decided this year to only allow 20 representatives. And actually there were 20, including legislators. So not all of them were diplomats or actual negotiators. This was because to reduce the carbon footprint, to address the negative perceptions of spending too much money in a difficult economy. The president was attending. There were about 80 other Mexican business people or NGOs representatives participating, paying their own way. But it was a very small delegation for the next host of the COP. In contrast, Brazil registered almost 1,000 people. NGOs, business representatives, journalists, family, I don't know, but it was, it actually had an impact. It actually had an impact on who was there assisting in, in participating in negotiations. When the Danes decided to control access because of the heads of state, and there was a lot of activism inside the center, this became a problem. These people, the ones who are there in a constructive role, they actually educate the policy process, and they give a contrast to or provide alternative solutions to the actual official negotiators. So they play an important role. So quickly on the three perspectives that I was able to capture. On the California agenda, I won't talk about it too much because probably you are very well informed about that, but I would just summarize this as the governor went there for the first time I heard in decades on a commercial flight to minimize his carbon footprint and reduce cost of his trip. He was there to raise the profile on the issue of the role of subnational governments taking action on climate change, as well as regional initiatives like the Western Climate Initiative. He attended several side events with mayors and governors from around the world. And his key proposal was to create, this is not a G, but it's an R, the R20 group. This would be a formation of collaboration between 20 subnational governments committed to finding grassroots solutions to combating global warming and stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions. And one thing is for sure, the governor has star power. During the negotiations, he was the only one to get a huge picture on the front page of the Financial Times. His picture was this big, Hillary Clinton's was this big, Obama's was half of it. And then as the BBC reporter was talking about leaders throughout the day coming into the Bella Center, he said, but perhaps the most famous of all, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So he does have star power, and he can move forward that agenda. Mexico, COP16. The good news, the weather will be nice, and Cancun is a beautiful place. Bad news, sunburns and dehydration could be also a problem. Mexico, during the negotiations, tried to remain relevant. Unfortunately for President Calderon, this seems to be a problem. The only time I saw him on primetime news on BBC and CNN was to announce the apprehension of a key drug lord in in Mexico's fight against this problem. Not being part of the G8 plus 5-1 group, Mexico kept working on promoting the Green Fund proposal, which was actually supported by Gordon Brown from the UK and was included in the formula of the Copenhagen Accord. Well, what has been done so far in preparation for Cancun? Well, logistics, a former Minister of Tourism has been appointed to be the coordinator for all logistics and of the event. There will be some infrastructure investment, and Cancun has hosted many international negotiations, including some very contentious WTO events, negotiations, and then they have developed already a master plan of all the actions that need to be taken care of. there is a little bit of infighting between the Ministry of the Environment and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The argument is that so far all the technical aspects have been discussed, so now it's time for the time calls for diplomacy to move forward. So we'll see who actually presides the COP. In terms of diplomacy, the Mexican diplomats and climate negotiators are, as we speak, have been dispatched to different countries, and they are on what was referred to me as consulting sessions on how to improve the process, how to bring in credibility, transparency, and commitment from parties. Right now, we have two official instruments, which are the ad hoc working group on further commitments for Annex 1 parties under the Kyoto Protocol, and the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action under the Convention. Those are the two official processes that are valid. The third one is the Copenhagen Accord, which is completely outside the UNFCCC process. It was a desperate effort by the Danes to come up with something. But it's not part, it's just a note to whatever was the official process. However, the Mexicans see it that it as, you know, it's a very delicate issue. When do you call Copenhagen dead? So that's where Mexico right now stands, and I'll just finalize end with the perspective from Lord Stern. Lord Stern says that we should look for a group of 20 representative countries that could start drafting what could be a deal or an accord, and actually enable some of those instruments like carbon markets to finance some of the transition to a low carbon economy, as well as other collaborative and cooperative efforts on technology development with developing countries to demonstrate to the rest of the world that this can be done. And I'll comment on other aspects later.
Thank you, Blas. Can I just press on one point for a second? And that is, so on the one hand, you described 1,000 people being accredited by one nation and the waiting in line and the star power. On the other hand, in the beginning, on the way forward, you were saying we need to reframe the dialogue, more voices, more transparency, which seemed like a deep commitment to the UN process. Doubling down on the UN process. This is the only way. And which is in contrast to what Lord Stern said at the end. But the question I have is, if you're not part of the alternative forums, the G20, the G30, however you want to count it, is the UN really what you believe is those countries would believe is the legitimate process?
Well, the majority of the countries believe that the UN is the place to negotiate. Why? Because their vote is as valid as the U.S. vote.
Right.
No. However, what I've heard, and I quote from a very high-level Mexican government official, is that the official process and the Copenhagen Accord are going to be given a fair chance. Let's say these next few months. Let's see how many people sign on the accord. Let's see what we can accomplish during the official meetings of the UN. Remember, the COP is still presided by the Danes, and it's managed by the Secretariat of the UNFCCC. So Mexico is in a very delicate position about, what we have now versus when do you bring in the alternatives, the fresh ways to go about solving the problem. So Mexico is not married with, it's just like, as I said, giving it a fair chance.
Very diplomatic. John, please.
Thank you. For all the reasons that Blas mentioned, I actually stayed away as much as possible from the actual negotiations. That which justified the trip, the carbon footprint and the cost, was a meeting at a place called Kronberg Castle just prior with a number of CEOs and a number of people like Lord Stern and so on to sort of take stock of the situation. For those of you who don't know Kronberg Castle, it's otherwise known as Hamlet's Castle, and the meeting took place with the presence of the Crown Prince, so we could have a Hamlet-like moment to sort of pose the question of, for the planet to be or not to be. So it was actually quite charming. Muhtar Kent, who's the CEO of Coca-Cola, had started talking about biodegradable bottles, and I thought, therefore, edible bottles. So I came to the conclusion that if the question was to be or not to be, the answer was let them eat Coke, right? But more seriously, I actually am less pessimistic about much of this than many of the speakers today. For the reasons that Chris Edley had mentioned, if we go back 4 years, who could have imagined that this issue would have been front and center in international negotiations? I think it's really a quite remarkable progress forward, quite apart from the clear and real difficulties of coming to an agreement, that we, in fact, have reached the point that this issue is widely recognized and is, in fact, central in being developed. So I think we need to acknowledge how far, in fact, we've come. My own view after many of these conversations is that part of the problem is that the issue has been, in some ways, misframed. That is, the focus of the issue on emissions itself, in fact, focuses the discussion, while it's critically the thing that needs to be controlled, focuses the conversation, in fact, on losses. It focuses the negotiation on the constraints that have to be applied, and, in fact, calls for China and the U.S. to have to come to an agreement to who bears these different costs. It also means that, in fact, it sets up the conversation for the emerging countries to say correctly that Western industrialization has, in fact, generated the emissions problem. So isn't it, in fact, the problem of the Western countries to solve the emissions problem? We want to get rich too, now you just get out of our way. It sort of sets up this winners-losers kind of conversation. What, in fact, is really, for the most part, at issue in this is what's generating the emissions, which is the energy system. And clearly what one needs to do is move from a high-carbon, low-efficiency energy system to a low-carbon, high-efficiency kind of energy system. And that transition, in the end, is a win-win situation. If we, in fact, are able to make that transition, everybody is a winner. And focusing on that transition, and I would add that there are a set of issues such as what to do about forests and a range of other questions that are, in fact, very important in this, but focusing on that transition, in fact, means everybody can win. There are a variety of kinds of things that can be done. The difficulty, of course, is this isn't the first transition. As many of the people working at Berkeley know, I mean, we went from wood to coal, from coal to oil, and into electricity, but none of it was quick. And the real constraint in this transition is, number one, that it has to be done quickly because of the emissions problem, which is the tally, if you will, the scorekeeper. And secondly, that, in fact, there were huge immediate economic advantages driving much of those early transitions, from wood to coal, coal to oil, and the like. And now much of this transition, at least in its early phases, is with higher cost energy replacing lower cost energy. It's a tougher kind of transition, and it's going to require different kinds of rules for government. So that said, I think that the problem needs to be framed around this transition, and it opens up a variety of different avenues for discussion. I would say that another way of framing the conversation that's been going on is that, and I think it's obvious to all of us, that, no China, no India, no deal. And I say no China, no India, not everyone else. No China, no India, no deal. No technology in the deal, or no route to a low-carbon growth and development future, and no India, no China. Technology in the deal, well, are the Western companies and countries going to just give away that technology? The answer is no. So the question becomes, how do you, in fact, come up with low-carbon strategies that, in fact, help develop and diffuse low-carbon technologies? And in a real sense, to my mind, that's the operational point at which this transition actually has to take place, in which emissions, if you will, is part of the scorecard, but it's hard to negotiate the score of a game, even if one needs to keep track of it. That said, that I think that there are a diverse set of things that need to be done. Rob and Blas have mentioned a number of them, running from emissions limitations, carbon trading, technology development, financial kinds of arrangements, And once you pose it that way, the reality is you don't necessarily want or need a single venue, because in fact the problems may in fact be handled in different ways in different spots, and you may treat the COP process as a way of sort of, again, keeping score of where the various individual negotiations are. So I think that the notion of multiple elements in this negotiation, not all being negotiated in the same place, I think is useful. Now, what I want to do for a moment, though, is take a step back and make a comment or two about the way in which the climate negotiations, in fact, differ from earlier negotiations in economic policy over the years since World War II. And I think that the first thing one needs to recognize in that is that the creation of the basic institutions of the international economy, originally the GATT and the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth, were all deals essentially between the United States and Europe. When the United States and Europe reached a deal, for the most part, they had the strength to be able to impose that deal or draw in others into those deals. Even with the entrance of Japan into the global economy in a major way, that didn't really change. And many of the major negotiations have really been Europe and the United States. And that was because the U.S. and Europe had the money, and we had the markets, which were things that other people wanted. So we had the negotiating cards, if you will. Climate is different in many ways. One important way is that you suddenly have the major new powers, China and now India, with the debate about how large the Chinese economy will be by the magical year 2050, running from 20% larger than the U.S. economy to 40% of the global economy, a position recently taken by Fogel at the University of Chicago. And suddenly they matter. And secondly, there's greater power because it's not just about money, though China has all our money, so it's a funny problem. It's not just about money, it is about the capacity to do harm. And the capacity to do harm by high carbon growth strategies means that, in fact, a larger array of countries have to be brought along. Therefore, the fact is neither the institutions nor the instincts and experience of many of those who have been engaged in international negotiation for a long time exactly fits the problem that's now at hand. And I think that big transition needs to be acknowledged. One other issue that I think needs to be acknowledged is that, it can't be a G2, but there is a reality to the G2 nonetheless, which is that China is the fast growth player in this. And China is deeply ambitious about its growth and about building technology autonomy. And precisely because, in fact, China is building out energy systems while Western Europe and the United States has to replace them for the most part, it, in fact, has the capacity to scale research investments into new systems that will give it considerable marketplace leverage. And in a certain sense, I think the issue that Obama was pointing at last evening is something I think worth emphasizing to those who are skeptics about climate warming. Whether or not climate warming is real, if the Chinese go ahead and act as if it is, they're going to dominate next generation technologies in ways that are powerfully significant for the United States. So I think that one of the strong arguments here really becomes how do we in fact all participate in this. It's not just us sharing our technology with quote unquote them, but in fact participating in the build-outs in wind and solar and the like, in underground coal gasification experiments and the like. Now, that said, the question that I want to put on the table, which maybe we can discuss a bit about, is exactly what is the role of the research university in all of this? Now, the Copenhagen Climate Council's initial meetings began really with a meeting on technology mitigation strategies, which Paul Wright helped fund, and Gary Baldwin helped organize, Michael Hanneman was present at that, and we brought along into that conversation a few significant speakers. Steve Chu came along as the keynote speaker, Arun Majumdar came as a speaker, and so forth. So that, in fact, there is a major role for the research universities, and I think there are 4 or 5, and I'll list them, not explore them, roles that can be, in fact, played. One is what some people would call carbon road mapping, which is an interest of CITRIS, which is, where are the levers? If we have to make this transition, where are the levers? And to use Graham Fleming's vocabulary, not all things have the same caliber. There may be levers that, in fact, if you pull on them, in fact, have a greater capacity to shift us from one domain to another, to invest in better internal combustion engines or in electric vehicles. It's not just a matter of research, it's a matter of where the bets need to be placed. The second is what kind of collaborative research arrangements can be made between the United States and China, between the United States and other places. Berkeley does that. So can we, in fact, build an environment that demonstrates clearly that these kinds of collaborative arrangements are possible and attractive? Thirdly, what kind of lessons for business strategy and intellectual property models can be drawn out of that? Some of the work that Rob and Blas have been doing that points in that direction. Fourth, I would say, and crucially, what do low-carbon growth and development strategies actually look like? What does that actually mean? How do we actually sustain economic growth and productivity and, in fact, do it in a low-carbon way? And lastly, I think, of course, what has been suggested here is, and with Blas and the Mexicans coming up next, as it were, what ways does a complex research university with great talent like ours, in fact, how does it, in fact, effectively contribute to the national and international debates? That last part we don't do. We do it individually, but we don't do it as a campus as well as some other places. So with that, let me just stop. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So let me just offer 2 comments on what John said, which I thought was very helpful framing for the discussion which now follows. I agree entirely that climate change is a totally different set of negotiations. And I have 2 comments. One, John tried to reframe the question as a technology shift. And we were discussing before that is a certain amount of optimism about the sufficiency of the technology shift as a solution. And in terms of negotiations, I've often thought that one thing unique in environmental negotiations is that there is a party in the room negotiating, namely the environment, that does not negotiate at all and doesn't even tell you its demands. And so you have to create something like the IPCC to figure out even what the demands are of this negotiator in the room. That's not going to give anything in the whole matter. And so I think there's a lot of efforts to reframe in a win-win way climate change negotiations. But it's like spinning on reality. You cannot spin reality at a certain point. So I'm not saying I know the answer about how much you can win-win out of this, but I think the IPCC would be more cautious about how far you can go with that. The second is I want to turn around your point about, which I think is an excellent point about economic relations and the negotiation history since World War II. I think from the developing world side, the statement would be not only India and China, but all of the poor countries, that you have ignored us for all this time, despite the great disparity in wealth, and basically because we have had nothing to enforce our demand to the apparent inequalities. And so it goes beyond India and China in a very deep way. And the growth of Indonesia is very complicated, so it's partly where's the population, but there's a moral character to it that has, I think, going back to Rob's point about power negotiation going on and a frustration with that history of what's been going on. So let's open it to the floor. We have a microphone that's going to be walked around, so if you can, we have 1 microphone or 2? 2. So if you can raise your hand, we'll get it to the next person. So we have one down front here. Down front here. So if you watch where I point, I'll help you. And if we can line up the next, would be great.
David, can people say who they are?
I'm sorry, and if people could for our benefit and for the benefit of our web audience, say who they are and their affiliation would be very helpful.
Mike Barr, Pillsbury, San Francisco. Question for Rob. You mentioned the discussions between the U.S. and China and how there were a number of initiatives on their plate right now, but might not go very far because of lack of funding. I wondered if you could identify which initiatives you thought were most worthwhile and what needs to happen to move them forward.
I'll read a list of the current U.S.-China energy initiatives and then mention which is most important. There's the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. There's the U.S.-China Electric Vehicles Initiative. There's the U.S.-China Energy Efficiency Action Plan. There's the U.S.-China Renewable Energy Partnership, the Shale Gas Initiative, and the U.S.-China Energy Cooperation Program. Now, this sounds like an awful lot going on. In fact, for example, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, it's really a case study in the most important initiative announced by Hillary Clinton when she went to Beijing in July, re-announced by President Obama when he went to Beijing in November. It's for energy research R&D centers in both countries to work on buildings energy efficiency on clean coal, carbon capture and storage, and clean vehicles. Total funding per country per year is only $15 million. Final implementation of that agreement has not been fully announced. Exactly where these centers will be, what they will do, who will put them in charge, let alone creating them. You know, time is clicking. Time is ticking away. And these are wonderful ideas. Wonderful people are involved in them. It's a bit disappointing, however, that action has not been taken faster and on a larger scale.
Right down front here.
Yeah, I'm Lawrence Emanuel from the Genesis Project in Berkeley. And first I wanted to make a comment that while Copenhagen was going on, there's big progress being made in energy technology. The Defense Intelligence Agency just has come out with a report that they now have reproducible cold fusion experiments going around the world in a number of places. And so the big public relations disaster that cold fusion was in 1989 now has been corrected. Then also since then, I've worked and discussing with people some fundamental physics theory that explains that is a model for what they've found empirically, and it also is a solid state theory. So essentially what's happening now is...
Sorry, can you focus your...
Right. Okay, no. Fundamental physics now is going to be essentially solid state. Things, high energy things called fusion, high temperature superconductors, very simple models, a lot of progress in that way. So it's not just quantum gravity, which is not useful to technology. And so how will this change all these negotiations? Because it means that things will sort of move from in information technology was the mainframe, slow-moving, large power stations, to a lot of new technology that's not well understood, of course, but with many inventions, many actors, and will require essentially a decentralized, more like network micro grids. And
I think we have the question. So the question to the panel is, and I'm not sure we have the expertise to answer this question, but I think it goes partly to you, John, in a way.
Well, I'm happy to...
Is there such a shift in technology on the horizon that it would fundamentally change this problem?
I think we can take the last part. Will it fundamentally change the negotiating problem?
Right.
And the answer to that, I think, is until the technologies are quite evidently close to market application or to actual government implementation in ways that are concrete and demonstrable, it will not change the negotiations. That sets aside the question on which we don't have expertise, which is, are any of these radical new technologies actually likely to come forward, or are they likely to come forward in a particular time frame? since much of technology projection is a gigantic speculation.
So it ties back to your point that even if there's a breakthrough in some dimension, there's a transition period, a tremendous practical transition.
Superconductors and so forth, you know, the actual application of them commercially is some years away.
Yeah. I'm sorry. In the back there, Naomi?
Thank you. Naomi Rodariasa, University of California, Hastings College of Law. My question is about the role of NGOs and whether you see, I mean, there was this kind of, I think, Rob, you mentioned one aspect of it, which is sort of NGO people becoming part of state delegations. Another part of it might be NGO people working both inside and outside. So can you talk a little bit about sort of going forward, because there was a lot of NGO presence, but I'm not sure there was a lot of NGO effectiveness, and I'd like to get your take on that.
I think you're right in that there is a big disconnect. There are many disconnects going on in the negotiations process. One of those disconnects is the disconnect between organized civil society and government delegations. In some cases, there is a very organic connection, as I mentioned, between developing nation delegations, especially for perfectly legitimate reasons. In many cases, small countries simply do not have the expertise to go deep into the weeds on a lot and negotiate effectively on a lot of these issues. So they do need effectively to subcontract out the work. For other countries, it's a different issue. But you know, is it all effective? Is there a cohesive voice, a cohesive dialogue going on? No. Exactly what's the answer? I mean, I think I would want to punt the issue, if I could ask Blas about the Mexican government's attitude toward NGOs. Calderon government being conservative. What's its views of dialogue and the role, the proper role, if any, of NGOs in this process?
And can I just add that you've made a reference to more voices. Now, do you mean by more voices, more NGOs, more room, more ways in which they can express their voice?
Yeah, I think what the Mexican government believes, from my exchanges with them, is that NGOs and the business sector do obviously represent important views, that they can play a constructive role, but that, and some of them are highly technically capable, think tanks and that have very developed analytical capacity. However, they will suggest to the UNFCCC Secretariat to be a little bit more selective on accreditation. I think they are going to try to lay out a plan on how NGOs can participate in COP16 way ahead of the COP. They will try to change the process on how NGOs participate. So the perception is that there is a valid role. You need to enhance the dialogue. You have to bring different perspectives out beyond the official role of state interest-based negotiations by diplomats. And so, multiple fora or some of the established ones will be used for that. However, at the COP, in Cancun, probably we will see less representation, less quantity, more quality. That's the idea.
I would like to add a couple of comments on this. The NGO role, it seems to me, is really two parts. One is to broadly engage the public, because the broader the public real awareness of the necessity of some of these changes actually is, the easier it is to reach them. The second is it's perfectly possible for NGOs to frame and help define what a number of the particular issues are, particularly in questions like technology possibilities and the like. Most of that at the international level will take place before the negotiations. It'll take place shaping the context of the negotiations. And the NGO's direct role, for the most part, will be in shaping national positions at the national level. Once you get to Copenhagen or you get to Mexico, this is a government-to-government process, and the rest is, frankly, as you described it, noise on the outside with long waiting lines. So I think one has to sort of know that they play a role and they matter, but in very specific ways.
Rob, could I follow up, because you sort of left something hanging there. You said you can understand why some states need this expertise, implying that something else is going on in other cases. So when you made the comparison to Blackwater, on the one hand, you can imagine subcontracting where you contract to someone who is your agent, someone that you give instructions to, someone you're responsible for what they do. So how does a developing state without the technical capacity, the infrastructure, oversee what this representative is negotiating on their behalf? Do you think there's a close understanding of the interests of the state and what that subcontractor is doing?
Well, in human relations, one always has to sort of be careful of other people's motives. Your motives, my motives, and when you have people negotiating on your behalf who are outside, you have to worry about, or not worry about, their motives. So, in the case of NGOs, of course, many pretend to be perfectly impartial, but we all have agendas, and you'll have a lot of competing agendas fighting themselves out. Specifically, in the case of climate change and technology, there is definitely a real pressure toward a lot of countries to take a tougher, developing nations to take a tougher stand, a more confrontational stand. I think you'll see in Bolivia in April, Evo Morales, the president, is having a big convention there on climate, and it will be a huge gathering of NGOs and whatnot that will, I think, illustrate the disconnect and dysfunctionality of the gap between the radical position of many nations, and not just the few who appeared to be the blockers at Copenhagen, but many others as well, and the broad thrust of the U.S. and the major economies. So I think, again, a further break is ahead that is being led in part by the NGOs.
Sorry, so Professor Arias, do you want to just follow up just quickly and either comment or question? This is an area of her expertise, and so.
Well, never refuse an invitation like that. I guess one of the things that struck me about sort of the NGO role in Copenhagen was that you also started getting interesting and sort of strange divisions even among the NGOs, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. I saw it a little bit in red in the forestry thing, where you had NGOs who thought this was a wonderful idea and NGOs that thought this was sort of going to, kill off all the forest peoples once and for all. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how those things play out.
Are there some other NGO type questions? Armin, is that no? Are there some other NGO, just to get a couple at once? Okay, so maybe just Rob, did you have
I just want to say that I've been to a few NGO-led meetings since Copenhagen here in the Bay Area, as they all try to figure out, well, what next? And there really is no agreement about what next, how tough a position to take, to go the Bolivia route, to or whether to essentially burn bridges with Washington, how to view the Copenhagen Accord itself, how to view the UNFCCC process, et cetera, et cetera. Zero agreement, zero consensus, and a great feeling of drift.
Okay. So we have a question here, and then two down front. Two. I think we'll have time to get to everyone.
My name is Kerry Curtis. I was at Copenhagen. I'm with Golden Gate University, and I was at Copenhagen as part of the Commonwealth Club delegation, and therefore I was an NGO. And I agree with Blas. That was not a good thing to be. At least I got into the thing. I was very disappointed with the outcome of the conference. Naturally, perhaps my expectations were unrealistic. But now it seems the potential is for independent, national, and bilateral kinds of initiatives. And with President Obama's State of the Union address fresh in my mind from last night, I'm wondering about the U.S. Congress energy bill, best version, well, the only version at this point being the Waxman bill. What effect could that have internationally if something like that were passed? And if so, in what ways should the Waxman bill be improved in terms of its international leadership effect?
Blas, do you want to comment on that from Lord Stern's side?
Well, I would say that obviously domestic action in the U.S. is very important. There are, from my perspective, I believe that, since it's going to be difficult to first get a global deal on action, that the G2, China, the U.S. kind of bilateral deal will be very important to at least be advanced or maybe close to, and within the realm of what could be done within the legislative initiatives in the U.S., maybe even a North American effort could be included. You know, the Congress, despite anything that has a UN label, CDM is not a valid currency within the, Congress. So maybe something, a new instrument within, let's say, a NAFTA ETS could be developed. And I know that there's been bilateral contact between the Mexican government and so I would say that it would strengthen the U.S. position if an energy bill like the Waxman Markey would be passed and advanced. But I don't see right now the political. The environment wouldn't allow it. I think jobs are the priority, and the political environment in Washington. I don't see it as that anything is going to be done soon. So.
Well, if I could just add to that, Simi Payne, who was here, organized a pre-Copenhagen conference some time ago, and there was a representative of the German negotiating team, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but they were trying to think through the formula of what the percentage reduction the U.S. would have to agree to. And then with generous understandings about how the U.S. is in a certain position and will take time to get to another position, that number was reduced for the U.S. And so I don't remember the exact number, but let's say it's 30 down to 25%. But the Waxman bill looks at a much smaller percentage.
16 is
very low. So on the one hand, in a foreign sense, it's something, but is it a big move? Right.
I wanted to bring our focus a bit closer even, and I think the most important legislative initiative is no longer Waxman Markey, but the implementation of AB 32, California's own climate legislation. This year, as you all know, CARB, the Air Resources Board, is releasing its very complex and incredibly important set of implementing measures to put the muscle behind that bill. However, AB 32 is under very severe attack in the elections this coming November. Both Meg Whitman and Steve Poizner have said the first thing that they'll do when they get into office is suspend AB 32 altogether. There's also a citizens voter initiative that's going to probably will qualify for the ballot to, again, suspend AB 32. If this happens, if either of these two goes through and AB 32 is suspended, that will be a devastating blow to, first of all, the subnational strategy. In the western United States, the Western Climate Initiative, western states and Canadian provinces, RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. A lot of these states use California's legislation as a template, so there will be an immediate domino effect on the subnational strategies around the country. One of those falling dominoes will hit Congress. It will be taken as a major blow against the movement toward American climate change legislation and action, and the domino will also hit the international negotiations. So, not to repeat the theme that, well, it's all about us, but in many ways it is. And this coming November in California will be a very crucial decision-making time.
John, do you have a comment?
Yes, two very brief comments. The first is that the new piece in the puzzle is obviously the EPA decisions to be able to regulate directly on the basis of carbon. That matters because it creates enormous uncertainty for business. And much of the regulatory frame in the United States, and as we all know, the general regulations have come when national businesses have found the uncertainty to be intolerable and have therefore moved to, in fact, find legislative settlements. So the state-level actions and the EPA actions I don't think will matter in the next 6 months, but I would suspect that degree of uncertainty will start to influence business choices. We're already hearing that. Companies and trade associations beginning to say, we need certainty, which in many cases they're willing to trade things they might not ordinarily agree to in exchange for that certainty.
Excellent. We have, let's take Armin down front and then in the middle. So Professor Rosenkranz.
Hi, I'm Armin Rosenkranz from Stanford, co-editor of the just published Climate Change Science and Policy, of whose 49 contributors, 5 are from Berkeley and LBL. 2 are in the room. I'm confused about China. Why did China delay or scuttle the negotiations for at least 2 days? What were they to gain over this issue of monitoring their domestic spending of international money? I don't quite see how. Why didn't they just resist it domestically, kind of go along, not make an issue of it, and resist it domestically if they felt they had to?
Well, this is a big question, sort of one of those rumors or truths, I don't know, that's in the paper about what was the role of China in this negotiation, why did they have that role. Perhaps we could go in turn. Rob?
Knowledge is power, and transparency is the lack of power. China sees these transparency measures as a potential route of vulnerability for their own policy-making power, and they view the international attempts to get increased transparency as essentially potentially undermining their autonomy to make their own decisions. So it's very significant and I think curious that while the U.S. press spun the final results of the Copenhagen Accord as giving the international community dramatically increased transparency for reporting of China's actions. In fact, if you look very carefully at the language, they got very little in terms of China's domestic actions. China only granted, or the developing nations only have granted under the Copenhagen Accord direct monitoring capability for those projects that are funded by foreign nations. That's a crucial difference. And if you look at the wording, China was very careful, and they held out precisely for that reason. Knowledge is power, and transparency is vulnerability.
Blas, I see you nodding in agreement.
Well, yeah, I would agree with Rob, but I would just put it more on the context of it's a sovereignty issue. China doesn't want monitoring from any outsider on anything that they do, maybe on very specific. If you bring the money, give me that technology, I'll let you be part of it. But outside of that, and this, even the voluntary pledges in the formula of the Copenhagen Accord requires some level of reporting, and that's what they don't like and they don't want. On the other hand, you could be more cynic about it and say, China's growing, they're doing their transition, and they're in some ways gaining a competitive advantage by doing things on their own. And even with cleaner technologies, they have very high standards in certain things. So eventually they might be a very powerful economy with a cleaner economy, and the U.S. will have to catch up, and the rest of the world will have to catch up to that. So we're talking geopolitics.
Two very quick comments. The first is Of course, China's busy trying to censor the internet, and it's busy with a fight with Google over Google's role. Information is, and its control of information is not just a marginal issue about climate here. It's central to the way in which the Chinese conceive their structure of their own governance internally. And I think this is, of course, a sovereignty issue. I think it also touches a nerve that would need to be resolved much more deeply in the Chinese political case. I think it actually is a core question. The second, which is a bit cynical and speculative, is China's an emerging power in a major way. And usually in historical terms, when we see new powers step onto the stage, we have real problems. Germany arrives, and we have minor issues that come up in the 20th century. China has enormous real power in money and military affairs if it wanted to exercise it, and it has not. And in some ways, this becomes a way of flexing its wings in a fairly safe way to sort of make it clear that you have to deal with China on its terms and have to deal with China as a new and significant player. So the fact that this issue, I think, does cut to sovereignty, cuts to the very structure of governance, and is a way of, in a funny way, safely doing this demonstration of Chinese power without bringing down the dollar or something like that.
So if
it's utterly a speculation.
I hear all three of you talking about China's deep commitment to this negotiating position. As far as the way forward, how important is this question for negotiators on the other side? Is it more important to get something going and think about this later?
I think the importance of it was shown by the Obama administration's efforts to spin the agreement as something that it was not. They very successfully spun the Copenhagen agreements on transparency to prove to the U.S. Congress that they got from China concessions on transparency. They didn't, but they made a lot of effort and they had a lot of success in spinning it as if they had. Again, it's a domestic issue. What do we get from China? What is China going to give up?
Good. In the middle, if we can get a mic to the woman in the middle there.
Hello, my name is Elin Lerenboason. I am a visiting scholar at the Department of Sociology here, but I come from the University of Oslo. I'm a political scientist. I have two questions for you. First, I really agree that it's a miracle that actually it seems like most of the countries in the world actually now accept that climate change is a real problem. I participated to many COPs, and this is really a change, that it gets all this attention. And I think one of the main reasons for this is the tremendous efforts of the IPCC. They have done a really good job in changing the perceptions of climate change, that actually now, although maybe not so much in this country, but elsewhere, people actually believe this is a problem. But we need another cognitive shift. We also need to believe that there are actually solutions to this problem. So I wonder whether you have any ideas on how we can create this second shift that is really needed, because we need not only media attention to how problematic this is, and especially for the developing countries who now believe that they will drown, they also need to believe that they can earn money on solutions. So that's my one question, and my other question is concerning the role of the EU. My research topic is EU climate policy, and I'm surprised that EU didn't have more effect on the negotiations, because they have delivered, although you can criticize this, they have actually delivered a climate policy that now targets most of the important industries in Europe. And why didn't this have more impact on the negotiations?
Thank you. And if we could bring the mic down front so we save some time. John, why don't we go in reverse order?
Well, I think that's exactly the question. When I sort of suggest that we should be looking at low-carbon growth and development strategies and what that would consist of, that's precisely what I mean. I think it's partly a research problem, partly a discussion problem, partly an understanding of technology and regulation. And it's very interesting that the Chinese, for example, want extensive conversations with places like Berkeley over both of those aspects. And not just the Chinese, but since we've, in a sense, put that focus. So I do think that if you propose to people that they make a transition and basically it's jumping off of a 110-story building and you don't tell them how to get where they're going, they're not going to be thrilled about the idea of trying. The second question, which I think and we should discuss perhaps offline because it's a standing interest of mine, which is the role of EU policy. Obviously, part of it is whatever the EU does, many of the crucial elements of that policy are national. And the actual negotiators in these cases are national grid. I mean, there are EU initiatives. I understand that. But I think because of that, it's been harder for them to actually exercise a voice. And I think the now appointment of Connie Hedegaard as a EU climate commissioner is, I think, an effort to try and create. Connie Hedegaard, for those who don't know, is the Danish Minister of Climate and Energy and Environment. As the EU commissioner may, in a sense, help them congeal a position in a negotiating strategy. But I think it's a very good question.
Blas, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just say, we know that there's no silver bullet and there's many ways to go about the problem. But what is key is to have some demonstration projects to show that there are solutions that work and enable some of the mechanisms that we know that exist. As I was mentioning, cap and trade could be a way to finance this transition to a low carbon growth development. The other, on the role of the EU leadership, I would just say that I think the fact that all these heads of state actually attended this meeting diminished the role of the EU as a bloc. I was just briefly mentioning that I saw it as a personality issue. They are all Angela Merkel, Sarkozy, and Gordon Brown. They feel they are the leaders of Europe. So in some ways,
They are.
and they are. Well, but they want to state it, and so the bloc didn't have a diplomatic effect. But I would go back to what I was saying. The EU does show through its own policies and measures that demonstration projects and collaboration with developing countries and that could help and serve as examples of possible solutions in the future.
Rob? As I mentioned in my initial remarks, I think what's really important is to have a short-term action plan over the next 9 months before COP16 to keep the process rolling. If there are no short-term implementation deals reached, there's a real problem, a real danger of the process crumbling further. Blas mentioned that the Mexican government is giving the process a few months to see if the UNFCCC can cut the mustard or whether new fora should be adopted. I wanted to basically go back to Blas and ask, Blas, do you think the Mexican government has a short-term implementation, short-term action plan, and what sort of actions would it want to see from the UNFCCC or another fora over the next 9 months?
Okay, so first, as I said, they're taking a wait-and-see position on the accord, see who actually endorses it or supports it. If it becomes a failed instrument or if it becomes an instrument that actually, in almost 20 years, if we want to get to mile 10, we've only moved to mile 2 through the official process. The accord actually moves us forward a long ways because it actually talks about pledges on commitments. It's as I said, it's a non-official process outside the UNFCCC, but actually has some very constructive proposals. So if it gets a lot of support, then this would isolate countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, and then most countries, this will have actually power to move forward. If that fails, as I said already, Mexicans, like Connie did, I think Michael and I met at least twice with her, visiting Berkeley, around the world, ahead of the delegation, the COP. Mexico's already deployed all these negotiators and diplomats around the world to see how can we change the process. And they are trying to develop, in a very diplomatic way, something without killing Copenhagen. So it's a difficult, but yeah, that's what they're working on. And what are going to be the meetings, and what is going to be the format, and what's going to be the new, fresh process to enhance the dialogue.
I want to make a concrete proposal, which is, I think bringing the EU in an important way would be a significant advantage to those who want to see some kind of real arrangement. Maybe we could actually host at Berkeley a meeting with, and I'm going to be specific, discussing the California initiatives in the next round of the COP16, and invite Connie and Olli Rehn, who's the Finnish commissioner, who's now commissioner for the economy. For those who don't know, Olli actually did a PhD at Oxford in political science, and is an academic and could come as an academic if he wanted to. He's, as you know, very influential in that, and we might do something like that and actually push things forward a little bit.
Thank you, John. Let me just ask Blas, you say several times wait and see, which can be viewed as a rather passive role. Whereas I think Rob is asking, what is Mexico as the host of COP16, as a leader in itself, trying to do to make that process continue?
Yeah, no, I think the Mexican government is, as I said, in a very delicate position. In fact, Lord Stern's proposal was presented in an editorial in London right after the meeting, and it said, this has to be done now. I actually forwarded that immediately to the office of the president. We've been talking about, however, reality strikes after. First, you have the winter break. Bureaucracy dies for 2 weeks. Then January, things start getting, jump-started again. However, as I said, the Danes still control the COP. They still preside over the COP. They don't want to see that Copenhagen Accord die. So that's where the fair chance is, okay, we're going to let you move forward with the instrument that emerged from COP15, but we are preparing. As I said, the Mexican government last week had its strategic planning meeting on the action to be taken, either in support of the official instrument or to bring in a new, fresh approach to the whole negotiation.
I see. Okay, we have a question down front here.
Hi, I'm James George with EnviroBeat. I was reporting in Copenhagen. I guess my question has to do with the ideas to restructure the COP. Early in this negotiation, maybe first or second day, Papua New Guinea proposed, and it's been proposed before, lowering the standard from a consensus base to a 3/4. And the question is, what possible outcomes could we have seen with a 3/4 principle? That if they didn't reach consensus, anyone who agreed to 3/4 could sign on, the others wouldn't. I mean, you could get the 1.5 degree target that the G77 and Tuvalu wanted, or you could get the Accord. You'd have multiple outcomes within a 3/4 vote scenario. And so I'm curious, what do you think could come of that? And sort of a follow-up question has to do with what Rob was saying about changing the mechanics, mechanically feasible changes to COP and the power. I asked Todd Stern, for example, about the climate debt idea, which is very popular. And he said, we acknowledge our emissions responsibility, but there's no debt because we didn't know, so the whole polluter pays notion doesn't count. Is it possible that these efforts to change the mechanical decision-making process are not just to get an agreement, but also to avoid those types of political issues? And so there's two questions there.
So broadly, this last question is about the way forward as far as changing structurally the COP and how it operates. And as we go to that, we're at the end of our time, so if you have any closing comment to make, would be appropriate also.
Okay. I will quickly say that it just, because of the UN system of a one vote, one country, one vote, nobody wants to devalue its vote. So the 3/4 does devalue your vote. So I don't see it as an actual possibility.
But there was a lot of critique saying we want that. Even England was calling for that.
Yeah, but from there to real action, you can be proposing. But it's on the table. And just finally, I would just say that we do need to take action. We've been discussing how to take action for many years. The Mexican government, I think, never thought they were going to be in this position of heavy lifting, but let's give them a chance. Mexico has a long tradition of good diplomacy. One of the few Mexican Nobel laureates got the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Tlatelolco Treaty of Non-Proliferation in Latin America. So there is, if there's some more communication with this G8 plus 5 minus 1, but they actually do meet at the G8 plus 5 meetings. And right now the president is in Davos. There's action already going on, and it's not that it's a passive role. It's just being a more cautious, but very with the intention of refreshing the whole process. So I would leave it with that more optimistic view.
Rob, please.
Regarding the UNFCCC, the analogy is with the U.S. Senate. To change the filibuster rule minimum of 60 votes would take 67 votes. You'll never get it. Ditto, to change the consensus rule in the UNFCCC would take a consensus vote. You'll never get it.
John, please, last words.
Sure. I think if we look at this, the question is, what do you actually need to negotiate finance, IP, and are there different domains in which that can be done and successfully achieved? I think that's, for me, the real rejiggering of the negotiating system. The question of should we move to, I agree with Rob, it would be very hard, if not impossible, to actually do. The question is, if you exclude some people, if China and India don't sign on, who cares? In Kyoto, if the U.S. doesn't sign on, who cares? A little less, but in a funny way. So the question is, who do you really need in these deals? And that's why breaking it up in some ways would be useful. Let me just close very briefly with the response to the questions that David posed to me indirectly at the beginning. Is technology, a carbon economy shift sufficient? No, but it's necessary. So that, in fact, if you don't get that shift from high carbon to low carbon, none of the rest of the conversation matters. Is it sufficient? Well, then we can take a look and see what else needs to be done. The issue about dealing with China and the other countries is, again, I think that because of the increasing scale of the Chinese and Indian economy, if we don't solve the problem practically with India and China, and the large growth countries, I would include Indonesia, the moral issue won't even get on the table. And on the other hand, if we can address that question, I think the broader issue of global development being rolled into this conversation is much more tractable.
Thank you very much to our panel.